Sandwich pan. Today's bread today.
Now, Northern Ireland homeowners, you'll have heard this in the news, £44 million in debt. The serious issue of negative equity really is biting in this part of the world. Advice NI's free debt service, Debt Action NI, expressed growing concern at the rapidly rising level of mortgage shortfall debt across Northern Ireland. But what can be done, and indeed, how do people cope? Let me speak to Phil Davison, who's an expert in the field with the group Negative Equity NI. Phil, good morning.
Hi Frank, how are you?
I'm very well, Phil. Phil, what sort of issues are people facing across the country at the moment? Just describe case scenario.
To be honest, Frank, it's the fallout from the property boom. House prices are sort of climbing in certain areas, which is a positive sign, but there are big parts of the province where the prices aren't rising and our wages are staying static. In fact, people's earning capacity has diminished over recent years, as I'm sure you know, and that leads people into a scenario where really the problem, it's not a housing problem, it's a debt issue, it's a historic debt issue that people are having real difficulty coping with. Bottom
line is, you've borrowed more money than your house is now worth.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's hard to look at these things, in the context of today, as they were at the time. Everybody was riding high on the hog. Money was easy. Money was easily borrowed globally. There was very, very easy availability to mortgages at rates that you wouldn't even contemplate now. In terms of multiples of people's income and things that were factored into availability or affordability calculations that wouldn't even be thought about now, and people are unfortunately having to deal with the fallout of that in the present context.
So someone bought a house at £450,000. It's now worth £200,000. They borrowed £300,000 or more to buy it. How do they face each day? Do they just say, right, I'm going to have to stay in this house and pay this huge mortgage repayment, or most of them losing their houses?
Well, it's not a case of losing their houses. It's a case of dealing with the debt. I mean, there's been a sea change in like currently we have 350 live clients, 17 staff working on this, so it shows you the height, and we're only one company, so it shows you the size of the problem. People's attitude towards owning their own home has changed somewhat through this, because your own home is seen as your nest egg. Well, what has happened is it has turned out to be the opposite of that for a lot of people. So what people are trying to do is deal with the debt effectively, and if you're in a position where you're a responsible person and you've done everything the right way, and you can no longer afford the debt that is owed, the situation then becomes more about what you can afford than what you owe, if you understand what I mean. And it's a case of getting in there, mediating an outcome that is better for the borrower, and in many cases can also be better for the lender as well. Lenders don't really want to get into the situation of repossessing homes. That doesn't work for them on a number of different fronts, and that's what we do. We get in there and we mediate an outcome that's the best for both parties, and I suppose that's the service in essence.
And the banks or the building societies or whoever you're liaising with on behalf of the client, do they accept any responsibility for selling people such a pig in a poke?
One of the first things we look at is mis-selling. There were certain lenders, not the main high street lenders, there were smaller that would have been referred to at the time as subprime lenders, who it could be said were involved in some fairly dubious activity, around their lending. But in most cases, people knew what they were doing. The banks are reasonable in the sense that the banks want to formulate. Most of the lenders that we deal with, and it isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, simply because different banks have different exposure to the market, are in different places. So it's a different scenario in the case of each and every lender. But in our experience, the lenders are very responsible, very open to a proposal that's put to them in the right way.
And when you say a proposal put to them in the right way, my man who bought the house at 450, it's now worth 200. He borrowed 300. What can you do for him, considering he's going to be 100 grand out here?
Mediate the debt.
But
let's come up with
something. Can you bring it down where you can say, right, it's you're going to have to pay less?
Typically, Frank, we're resolving those things at somewhere between 8 and 10 pence in the pound at the moment. You know, as the man says, it's a country saying, but you can't get feathers off a frog. And you know, if the people don't have the money to do it, you know, the next best situation from paying all that they owe is to pay what's reasonable, you know, a reasonable amount on that, and that's very much to the benefit of the lender and the borrower. So
if you're still in employment, say husband and wife are still well enough healed, but they're seriously in debt,
yes,
there are feathers on that frog.
There are, but there may not be enough to suit long term. I mean, in most cases, our clients tend to be professional people. They tend to be people that are two incomes. But in an awful lot of those scenarios, he doesn't quite earn the overtime that he had. We see a lot of civil servants, austerity cutbacks. We see a big thing that we see are unfortunately, you know, people who are splitting up marriages. It used to be that there were assets to split up, but now in an awful lot of occasions there are debts to split up. How are those dealt with, you know, going forward when people aren't even together anymore? So there's a lot of different scenarios there. But as I say, I mean, banks are open to, if people had an understanding of how banks have to react to bad debt on their books, it's very much in a bank's favour to resolve these things speedily.
And whenever you're going out to look for advice, obviously there's free advice out there. Yours is professional advice. Obviously, there's a cost. But what can your company or any other similar company offer to justify the cost?
A professional service, suitably qualified people. We have insolvency trained staff, accountants, ex-bank staff. We have really what people are paying for is the leverage and of our relationship with the banks. The other thing is we're heavily regulated. I mean, we're super regulated by the FCA, and with us in terms of a professional service, if we get it wrong, clients have redress. They can sue us. We've got lots of PI cover, you know. So in terms of our service, but that's not to demean any of the free advice services that are out there. And even in our case, you can come and talk to us for nothing. We don't charge for a consultation. If somebody needs to talk to us, get a bit of advice, and we do a certain amount of pro bono work. If somebody wants to talk to us, we're happy to talk to anybody about their situation, and they will leave more informed than they came. If they choose to engage us as a professional service, we charge for that, but you know, we're a business, we have to. But there's a lot of good Christians Against Poverty, St Vincent de Paul, there's some great charities out there doing work in this field.
Do you come across a lot of hard luck stories, people who are at the end of their tether, almost tears in their eyes when they're talking to you?
We do, very much so, yeah, very much so. We do. We come across a lot of people who, you know, the dream has very much turned sour for them. You know, people that are towards the end of their working careers but have these big interest-only mortgages, that they're having real difficulty, that they have no repayment vehicle at the end of the time. So even though they can make the payments now, ultimately, whenever they get to the end of this mortgage period, they're still left with an amount of money for a property that they can't pay. We see a lot of people at the minute who bought foreign property that has turned on them, which is another thing. But we come across some very, you know, some very difficult cases. I'll put it that way, where there's a lot of emotion involved. But we're sensitive to that, you know.
People must have some shocking regrets about purchases they made halfway through the last decade.
Very much so, Frank, but unfortunately it was something we all get caught up in. You know, if you think about how things were there, you know, the trees were going to grow to the sky. Everybody was making a fortune. If you talk to anybody, everybody had investment properties. The money was, you know, money was easily borrowed for banks. Banks made it easily available to the public. We borrowed it in quantities, and yeah, unfortunately, we're going to be paying for it for maybe for the next 5 or 10 years.
I must say, Phil, with the exception of one person, you say everyone was looking at the trees growing to the sky, with the exception of our business editor, Jamie DeLargy. I've said this before on the radio and I'll say it again. I was walking through the Holy Land area and there were for sale signs up and they were selling houses at 200 grand or whatever crazy money it was. And I said, Jamie, you know, I have a youngster growing up and I think it's about time to buy something like this because these houses are going to get so expensive that we're never going to be able to afford them. And Jimmy said to me, trust me on this. there's something wrong with the market. I don't know what it is, but this cannot be sustained. And a man who's now in politics, I'll say no more than that, was part of the conversation as well. And he turned it to us, and he was working with us, and he said, it's one of two, you can guess which one. But he turned to us and he said, they're not making any more land. The prices won't come down. And I was actually thinking that as well, because that's the old adage, they're not making any more land, the prices can't come down. And Delargy came back at us and he said, there's something wrong. There's something wrong, and I don't know what it is. How right was he?
Very much so. Maybe the wrong man was in politics.
That's a very good point.
All right.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you now.
Phil Davis
Bye-bye.
from Negative Equity NI. I don't think Fergal McKinney will mind me saying that it actually was him. He was using the old cliche, they're not making any more land, and that's what everybody thought. Right, it is 18 minutes to 11.